In 1943, Allied High Command looked at Major Ed Larner's new tactic and called it reckless. They called it a suicide run. They banned it twice, forbidding him from even practicing it. But Larner and his boss, General George Kenney, knew a terrible truth. The conventional way of fighting wasn't working. And 7,000 Japanese soldiers were, at that very moment, steaming south to reinforce New Guinea. Every single man in that convoy who made it ashore meant more American and Australian blood would soak the jungle floor. At 6:30 in the morning, March 1st, 1943, that 25-year-old major stood on the wet coral runway at Port Moresby. He'd already flown 72 combat missions, and in all that time, his crews hadn't sunk a single major ship. This was the crisis for the entire 5th Air Force. It wasn't for lack of trying. For 8 agonizing months, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells had been flying by the book, attacking Japanese convoys from 10,000 feet. Their hit rate was a miserable 3%. Think about that. 97 out of every 100 bombs dropped missed. They splashed harmlessly in the vast, empty ocean while the Japanese ships, untouched, steamed right on through. The mathematics were just brutal. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from that altitude took 37 seconds to hit the water. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer moving at 30 knots could cover 380 yards. That's nearly 4 football fields. The bombardier would aim perfectly at where the ship was. By the time the bomb arrived, it hit nothing but the ship's white, churning wake. Larner had seen it time and time again. Crews would come back exhilarated, claiming direct hits. They'd even have the gun camera footage to prove it. Perfect photos of bomb patterns exploding right around the ships. But around wasn't on. The Japanese just kept sailing. But the Japanese gunners weren't missing. They shot down the high-altitude bombers with methodical, lethal precision. While American pilots were lining up their 37-second drop, Japanese gunners had all the time in the world. They tracked the approach, they calculated the lead, and they bracketed the bomber formations with curtains of flak. Larner's own squadron had lost 4 aircraft in the last month, trying this failed tactic. 40 men, 40 families back home, who would get a telegram because of a strategy that just didn't work. This failure is why General Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had proposed something that sounded utterly insane to every seasoned pilot who heard it. He said, "Don't drop the bomb, throw it." He wanted his pilots to skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. The plan was simple, and it was terrifying. Fly in at just 50 feet off the waves, race straight at the ship. At 300 yards, release the bomb, which had a 5-second delay fuse. The bomb's own momentum would carry it across the water. It would skip once, maybe twice, and slam directly into the ship's hull. It would detonate right on the waterline, or just underneath it, tearing the heart out of the vessel. The physics theorists said it would work. The pilots who had to fly it said it was suicide. Flying a 15-ton twin-engine bomber 50 feet off the ocean, straight into the teeth of a Japanese destroyer, bristling with guns, it violated every survival instinct a man had. Those destroyers weren't sitting ducks. They carried 127mm main guns, 25mm cannons, and dozens of machine guns. And all of them could track a bomber flying that low. One good hit to an engine, and the B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew even knew they were hit. This was the kind of impossible choice these men faced every day. If you believe their stories deserve to be remembered, take a second to hit that like button. It truly helps us ensure this history isn't forgotten. Because it was so dangerous, High Command had banned the tactic twice. Larner's requests to practice skip bombing in December and again in January were both denied. The official response called it a reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. Crews were ordered to focus on proven high-altitude tactics. But those proven tactics weren't sinking ships, and the Japanese convoy was getting closer. This was the moment of truth. Larner had to make a choice: obey orders and let the 7,000 troops land, guaranteeing a bloody, protracted fight in the jungles, or defy the ban and risk 60 of his men on a tactic that might be a death sentence. Larner didn't make the choice alone. General Kenney had seen this coming. He had given his men a new tool. 5th Air Force mechanics, under a man named Pappy Gunn, had done something revolutionary. They took the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber, and ripped the bombardier's station out of its glass nose. In its place, they bolted 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. They added 4 more in blisters on the fuselage. Suddenly, the B-25 wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying gun platform, a strafing gunship that could pour 200 rounds of 50-caliber lead into a target every second. The theory was simple: suppress the enemy's guns. You couldn't just fly at a destroyer and hope they missed. You had to give those Japanese gunners a reason to duck, make them choose between returning fire and staying alive. Larner had watched them bolt the guns on 3 weeks earlier. It added 1,200 pounds. It shifted the plane's center of gravity. It turned his bomber into something that had never existed before in the history of warfare. And this is where Larner and Kenney had taken their biggest risk. Despite the official ban, they had practiced in secret. Kenney had found the perfect target: the wreck of the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that ran aground near Port Moresby back in 1924. It sat there, rusting and half-submerged, a perfect stationary target. Larner's crews flew practice runs at dawn and dusk, when the light was poor and prying eyes from headquarters were few. They learned how to skim the wavetops at 270 miles an hour. They learned to judge the distance by eye. And they learned what happens when you get it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett had gotten it wrong on February 16th. He came in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. His bomb skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and exploded harmlessly 300 yards beyond it. A total miss. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, recalculated. Lower, faster, a closer release point. On the next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's hull, right at the waterline. It was a perfect hit, right where a ship's engine room or magazine would be. Right where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of enemy ammunition and blow a warship in two. But there was one terrifying difference. The Pruth wasn't shooting back. Now, standing in the operations tent, Larner spread the reconnaissance photos across the planning table. The convoy was spotted at dawn, steaming through the Bismarck Sea. 8 fat transports, packed with soldiers, artillery, and ammunition. 8 destroyers screening them. Every officer in that tent knew what this meant. They remembered the battle for Buna just months earlier. Japanese reinforcements there had turned a short fight into a 6-month nightmare that cost 5,000 Allied lives. If this convoy got through, Leh would be Buna all over again, but worse. Larner laid out the plan they had been forbidden to practice. He assigned every pilot a specific target, transport 1 through 8. The Royal Australian Air Force would go in first. Their Beaufighters would strafe the convoy, a distraction to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then B-17s would bomb from high altitude. This wasn't to sink them, it was to scatter them, to force the Japanese captains to break formation and start evasive maneuvers, making them isolated targets. And then Larner's 9 B-25s would come in, 50 feet, the killing blow. The math had to be perfect. Approach at 50 feet, speed at 270 miles per hour. Release at 300 yards. Fuse set for 5 seconds. Miss any single variable, and the bomb would skip over the ship, detonate short, or sink harmlessly. His orders were chilling. No bomber will attack the same ship twice. This was about maximum efficiency. One pass, one bomb, one chance. The crews filed out at 0700, 54 men in 9 B-25s. Larner climbed into his aircraft. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already running the pre-flight checklist. The bombardier, Staff, Sergeant Carl Walls, was checking the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. Nobody spoke. This crew had flown together for 9 months. They knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They knew the odds. Larner started the port engine, then the starboard. The big Wright Cyclone engines roared to life. His flight would take off first. They would fly low, under 100 feet, the entire way. Japanese radar at Rabaul couldn't track aircraft flying that low. Their only advantage, their only hope, was surprise. At 0745, Larner released the brakes. By 10 o'clock, he would either be a hero or he would have led his entire squadron to a slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 120 agonizing minutes. Larner held his formation at just 30 feet above the ocean. They were so low that spray from the wavetops spattered his windscreen. Radio silence. The Japanese monitored every frequency, one stray transmission, and the convoy would know they were coming. Larner checked his watch. 0900. The convoy should be 60 miles northeast, but flying this low, he couldn't see more than 5 miles. His navigation had to be perfect. 5 degrees off course, and they would miss the convoy entirely in the empty ocean. At 0955, Larner spotted it. Smoke on the horizon. The black diesel exhaust of 16 ships. He keyed his throat mic once. Click, the signal to tighten formation. The convoy took shape. 2 columns of transports. Destroyers forming a protective screen. Larner counted the guns on the nearest destroyer. Every single one of them would be firing at him in minutes. At 10 o'clock, the first part of the plan began. The bow fighters. Larner watched as 13 Australian aircraft dove on the convoy. Their cannons raked the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. Just as planned, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat. The gunners were looking the wrong way. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived. Bombs tumbled from 10,000 feet. This was the signal. The Japanese ships began turning hard, breaking formation, scattering. The destroyers accelerated, churning white water. It was perfect chaos. Larner's voice came over the radio, breaking the silence. "Bombers! Attack!" He descended to 40 feet. Sergeant Walls was calling out the distance. 4,000 yards. 3,600. Larner picked his target. The second transport in the port column. 700 feet long, sitting low in the water. Fully loaded. He would aim right where the troop compartments were. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward his formation. They were high. The Japanese gunners were still thinking high altitude. They hadn't adjusted yet. 2,000 yards. Larner opened fire. All 850 caliber guns hammered the ship. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on deck dove for cover. It was working. The enemy gun crews couldn't shoot back while 50 caliber rounds were tearing their positions apart. 1,200 yards! Larner's wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its own ship. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships all at once. 800 yards. The destroyer fired again. This time the shells bracketed his plane. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Benz, the co-pilot, yelled, "Hit! Port engine oil pressure dropping!" 600 yards. The transport filled his entire windscreen, a wall of steel rushing toward him. Every instinct in his body screamed, "Pull up." 400 yards. Bomb armed, ready. 300 yards. Larner hit the release. He felt the B-25 lurch upward as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. He watched it fall. It hit the water, skipped once, and slammed into the transport's hull. "Climb! Climb!" Larner hauled back on the yoke. The 5-second fuse was counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He didn't see the explosion. He felt it. The shockwave hit his aircraft like a giant's fist, throwing the tail up and slamming the plane sideways. Benz fought the controls. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting in half. A column of black smoke and fire erupted from its middle. Secondary explosions rippled through the deck as ammunition cooked off. The ship was already listing, soldiers jumping from the decks. One bomb, 15 seconds. It had worked. To his right, Jake Fawcett's bomber pulled up. Another transport was burning. To his left, Captain Bill Hayes had just hit a destroyer. The bomb skipped and hit the stern. The destroyer's rear third simply vanished in the explosion. 4 targets were hit in the first 90 seconds. But the Japanese were adapting. A destroyer on the far flank tracked Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed, the second missed, the third hit. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated. The bomb detonated. The plane vaporized. 5 men, gone in an instant. Larner saw the debris scatter. No time to mourn. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the convoy flagship. This time, the ship was ready. 20mm cannons, machine guns, even rifles fired from the deck. The air was solid with tracers. Johnson held his course. His bomb punched through the hull. The ship erupted in flames. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took hits. 20mm shells ripped his port wing open. Fuel streamed out. He held his course. At 150 yards, he released. A perfect hit. He banked hard right, trailing fire. 6 transports were burning. 2 destroyers were crippled. 1 B-25 was lost. The attack had lasted 4 minutes, and now the second wave of B-25s was coming in. 9 more bombers from the 90th Bomb Squadron. They had watched Larner's attack. They knew it worked. They also knew the cost. But this time, the Japanese were ready. Every gun in the convoy was tracking low. The remaining destroyers had formed a defensive line, firing in coordinated volleys. The ocean erupted with shell splashes. The Japanese had learned. They would make the Americans pay for the second pass. Major Ralph Chell, leading the second wave, came in from the east, flying directly out of the sun. It was a smart move. The Japanese gunners were blinded. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing. The ship rolled over and went under in less than 2 minutes. 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach was wrong, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, over the destroyer, and exploded harmlessly. He pulled up to circle for another run. This was a fatal mistake. The destroyer he'd missed tracked him the entire turn. When Jensen came around again, they were waiting. The first shell took off his engine. The second hit the cockpit. The B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. 8 minutes into the battle, Larner realized with a cold dread that 60 Japanese Zero fighters were still somewhere above the clouds. At 09:15, they appeared. 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. Silver shapes dropping like hawks. The P-38 Lightning escorts were supposed to keep them busy. Something had gone wrong. Larner's B-25 was vulnerable. He was low on fuel. He was low on ammunition. His nose guns were nearly empty. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to the wavetops. 20 feet, 15 feet. His propellers were churning salt spray. The Zeros came in fast, 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing. Tracers arced past Larner's canopy. He jinked left, then right. Behind him, his dorsal gunner, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake, fired short bursts. But Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber, the one leaking fuel, wasn't so lucky. A Zero latched onto his tail. Warren tried every maneuver, but the Zero pilot was patient. He waited until Warren stalled in a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over. Larner saw 3 parachutes. 3 out of 5. For 6 minutes, the Zeros pressed their attack. Then, suddenly, they broke off. Larner saw why. The B-17s were coming back for another pass. The Zeros had to choose: finish the low-level bombers or defend the convoy from the high-altitude threat. They chose to defend the convoy. This kind of multi-layered, combined arms strategy was what separated a simple raid from a decisive battle. Many of the most fascinating stories from the war involve this kind of tactical genius. We cover them every week, so if you're enjoying this, make sure you're subscribed. Larner used the reprieve to check his instruments. Port, engine, running rough, Oil pressure fluctuating, fuel 60%, enough to get home. Maybe. He looked back at the convoy. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The 8th was burning, trying to beach itself. 4 destroyers were damaged, 2 dead in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over. It was 0921. The attack had lasted just 11 minutes, but the killing would continue for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt the survivors in their lifeboats. The Japanese had committed 7,000 troops. Fewer than 1,200 would ever reach Leh. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure. Larner set his course for home. 4 bombers were confirmed lost, 20 men. But the mission, the suicide run, had worked. This single tactic would be refined, standardized, and taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon all attempts to move large convoys near Allied air power. The supply line was strangled. The war would turn, but Larner didn't know that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. He ordered his crew to dump everything, ammunition, tools, anything to reduce weight. The B-25 was struggling to stay in the air. At 10:10, Ben spotted land. The southern coast of New Guinea. The port engine was shaking violently now, oil streaming from a crack. The temperature gauge was in the red. Larner feathered the prop, cutting the engine. He transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed. The engine held. He landed at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews. Word had spread. Larner cut the engines and just sat for 30 seconds, his hands still gripping the yoke. The debrief lasted 2 hours. 5 of the 9 pilots had returned. Mitchell was gone. Jensen was gone. Warren's crew, thankfully, had been picked up by a Catalina flying boat. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. The images told the story. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk. The 8th was beached and burning. 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 severely damaged. General Kenney arrived at 1600 hours. He didn't congratulate anyone. He pointed at the reconnaissance photo of the 1 burning transport still on the beach. He just said, "Finish it." And the second strike launched at 1730. By 2000 hours, they were back. The beached transport was gone. The 2 damaged destroyers were caught trying to withdraw. Both were sunk. The Japanese started with 16 ships. By nightfall, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The cost in lives was catastrophic. 7,000 Japanese soldiers embarked. Only 900 survivors were counted reaching the shore. American PT boats intercepted the lifeboats. Command had ordered no quarter. This was a grim reality of the Pacific War. The Japanese had often machine-gunned American air crews in their parachutes. At Bismarck Sea, the Americans, hardened by months of brutal fighting, returned the favor to soldiers in the lifeboats. Larner learned about it later. He didn't ask for details. The war had rules, until it didn't. The rules had stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last Japanese transport going under. The final numbers were staggering. Japanese losses, 12 ships, nearly 6,000 men. American losses, 13 aircrew killed. Skip bombing had worked. But the question remained, would it work against an enemy who was prepared? 3 months later, the Japanese tested that question. They formed a new convoy. This time they sailed at night. This time they had 60 Zeros providing air cover. And this time, every destroyer had new 20mm anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to defend against low-altitude attacks. The 5th Air Force attacked. 12 B-25s. The results were different. 2 transports hit, 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. The Japanese had learned. So the Americans adapted in return. By July, mechanics added more armor around the B-25 cockpits. They increased the forward firing guns to 12 50 calibers. Some B-25s carried 14. The theory remained, overwhelm the gunners. On November the 2nd, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor. This time, the ships were trapped. They couldn't maneuver. The raid lasted 18 minutes. 30 ships were hit. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. American losses. 2 B-25s. Skip bombing was devastating against ships trapped in harbor. It was far more dangerous in the open ocean. The statistics tell one story. Between 1943 and 1945, skip bombing sank 212 Japanese vessels. It was 15 times more effective than high-altitude bombing. But the human cost was harder to measure. This tactic required crews to fly steady, straight, and low, directly at guns that were firing at them. The psychological stress was immense. Pilots who flew skip bombing missions had shorter combat tours and higher rates of combat fatigue. The tactic worked, but it broke the men who flew it. Major Ed Larner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. The Army Air Force wanted him to train new crews. He refused. He requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft. He spent the rest of the war flying C-47s, moving supplies, no combat. No more watching men he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. He never explained the decision. He never had to. Command understood. He declined a promotion to lieutenant colonel twice before finally accepting. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted to finish the war and go home. When Ed Larner died in 1993, his obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. It didn't mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It didn't mention skip bombing. He had asked his family not to discuss it. General Kenney received the official credit in most history books. Larner was fine with that. Kenney had the theory. Larner had just been the one to prove it worked. But the pilots knew. The men who flew the missions knew who had led that first attack. They knew whose techniques kept them alive when the tracers were filling their windscreens. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is largely forgotten today. It doesn't have the name recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. But what remains is this. A group of American aircrews proved that aircraft could sink warships by flying 50 feet off the water. It was called suicide before they proved it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth is, it was desperation meeting innovation. It was men willing to try the impossible, because the proven methods were failing. These stories of quiet courage are the ones that move us the most, and they are the ones most often lost to history. If this story moved you, please, drop a comment below and just let us know you were here. Tell us where you're watching from.